Capital, Volume 1. This independent recording by Andrew S. Reitenberg is public domain, both in content and in audio. Part 4. The Production of Relative Surplus Value. Chapter 12. The Concept of Relative Surplus Value. That portion of the working day which merely produces an equivalent for the value paid by the capitalist for his labor power has, up to this point, been treated by us as a constant magnitude. And so it is, under given conditions of production and at a given stage in the economic development of society. As we saw, the worker could continue to work for 2, 3, 4, etc. hours beyond this, his necessary labor time. The rate of surplus value and the length of the working day depended on how far this extra time was prolonged. Although the necessary labor time was constant, we saw, on the other hand, that the total working day was variable. Now suppose we have a working day whose length and whose division between necessary labor and surplus labor are given. Let the whole line AC, that's A to B with 10 lines, and B to C with 2 lines, represent, for example, a working day of 12 hours. The section AB represents 10 hours of necessary labor, and the section BC represents 2 hours of surplus labor. How can the production of surplus value be increased? I.e., how can surplus labor be prolonged without any prolongation or independently of any prolongation of the line AC? Although the boundaries of the working day A and C are given, it would seem possible to lengthen the line BC, other than by extension beyond its endpoint C, which is also the end of the working day AC, by pushing back its starting point B in the direction of A. Assume that B prime to B, in the line A to B prime with 9 lines, B prime to B with 1 line, and B to C with 2 lines, is equal to half of BC, or to 1 hour's labor time. If now, in AC, the working day of 12 hours, we move point B to B prime, then BC becomes B prime to C. The surplus labor increases by 1/2 from 2 hours to 3 hours, although the working day remains 12 hours as before. This extension of the surplus labor time from BC to B prime C from 2 hours to 3 hours is however evidently impossible without a simultaneous contraction of the necessary labor time from AB to AB prime, from 10 hours to 9 hours. The prolongation of surplus labor would correspond to a shortening of necessary labor, i.e., a portion of the labor time previously consumed in reality for the worker's own benefit would be converted into labor time expended for the capitalist. There would be an alteration, not in the length of the working day, but in its division into necessary labor time and surplus labor time. On the other hand, it is evident that the duration of surplus labor is given when the length of the working day and the value of labor power are given. The value of labor power, i.e., the labor time necessary to produce labor, determines the labor time necessary for the reproduction of the value of labor power. If 1 hour of work is embodied in 6 pence, and the value of a day's labor power is 5 shillings, the worker must work for 10 hours a day in order to replace the value paid by capital for his labor power, or to produce an equivalent for the value of the means of subsistence he needs to consume every day. Given the value of these means of subsistence, the value of his labor power can be calculated, and given the value of his labor power, the duration of his necessary labor time. The duration of the surplus labor, however, is arrived at by subtracting the necessary labor time from the total working day. 10 from 12 leaves 2, and it is not easy to see how, under the given conditions, the surplus labor can possibly be prolonged beyond 2 hours. No doubt, the capitalist could, instead of 5 shillings, pay the worker 4 shillings 6 pence, or even less. 9 hours labor time would be sufficient to reproduce this value of 4 shillings 6 pence, and consequently 3 hours of surplus labor, instead of 2, would accrue to the capitalist, and the surplus value would rise from 1 shilling to 1 shilling 6 pence. This result, however, could be attained only by pushing the wage of the worker down below the value of his labor power. With the 4 shillings 6 pence, which he produces in 9 hours, he commands 1/10 less the means of subsistence than before, and consequently, the reproduction of his labor power can take place only in a stunted form. The surplus labor would in this case be prolonged only by transgressing its normal limits. Its domain would be extended only by a usurpation of part of the domain of necessary labor time. Despite the important part which this method plays in practice, we are excluded from considering it here by our assumption that all commodities, including labor power, are bought and sold at their full value. If we once assume this, it follows that the labor time necessary for the production of labor power, or for the reproduction of its value, cannot be lessened by a fall in the worker's wages below the value of his labor power, but only by a fall in this value itself. Given the length of the working day, the prolongation of the surplus labor must of necessity originate in the curtailment of the necessary labor time. The latter cannot arise from the former. In the example we chose, the value of labor power had to fall in fact by 1/10 in order for the necessary labor time to be diminished by 1/10, i.e. from 10 hours to 9, and for the surplus labor to consequently be prolonged from 2 hours to 3. A fall of this kind in the value of labor power implies, however, that the same means of subsistence formerly produced in 10 hours can now be produced in 9 hours. But this is impossible without an increase in the productivity of labor. For example, suppose a cobbler with a given set of tools makes 1 pair of boots in 1 working day of 12 hours. If he is to make 2 pairs in the same time, the productivity of his labor must be doubled, and this cannot be done except by an alteration in his tools or in his mode of working, or both. Hence the conditions of production of his labor, i.e. his mode of production, and the labor process itself must be revolutionized. By an increase in the productivity of labor, we mean an alteration in the labor process of such a kind as to shorten the labor time socially necessary for the production of a commodity, and to endow a given quantity of labor with the power of producing a greater quantity of use value. Hitherto, in dealing with the production of surplus value in the above form, we have assumed that the mode of production is given and invariable. But when surplus value has to be produced by the conversion of necessary labor into surplus labor, it by no means suffices for capital to take over the labor process in its given or historically transmitted shape, and then simply to prolong its duration. The technical and social conditions of the process, and consequently the mode of production itself, must be revolutionized before the productivity of labor can be increased. Then, with the increase in the productivity of labor, the value of labor power will fall, and the portion of the working day necessary for the reproduction of that value will be shortened. I call that surplus value which is produced by the lengthening of the working day absolute surplus value. In contrast to this, I call that surplus value which arises from the curtailment of the necessary labor time, and from the corresponding alteration in respective lengths of the two components of the working day, relative surplus value. In order to make the value of labor power go down, the rise in the productivity of labor must seize upon those branches of industry whose products determine the value of labor power, and consequently either belong to the category of normal means of subsistence or are capable of replacing them. But the value of a commodity is determined not only by the quantity of labor which gives its final form, but also by the quantity of labor contained in the instruments by which it has been produced. For instance, the value of a pair of boots depends not only on the labor of the cobbler, but also on the value of the leather, wax, thread, etc. Hence, a fall in the value of labor power is also brought about by an increase in the productivity of labor, and by a corresponding cheapening of commodities in those industries which supply the instruments of labor and the material for labor, i.e., the physical elements of constant capital which are required for producing the means of subsistence. But an increase in the productivity of labor in those branches of industry which supply neither the necessary means of subsistence nor the means by which they are produced leaves the value of labor power undisturbed. The cheapening of the commodity, of course, causes only a relative fall in the value of labor power, a fall proportional to the extent to which that commodity enters into the reproduction of labor power. Shirts, for instance, are a necessary means of subsistence, but are only one out of many. The total sum of the necessary means of subsistence, however, consists of various commodities, each the product of a distinct industry, and the value of each of those commodities enters as a component part into the value of labor power. The latter value decreases with the decrease of the labor time necessary for its reproduction. The total decrease of necessary labor time is equal to the sum of all those different reductions in labor time which have occurred in those various distinct branches of production. Here we treat this general result as if it were the direct result and direct purpose in each individual case. When an individual capitalist cheapens shirts, for instance, by increasing the productivity of labor, he by no means necessarily aims to reduce the value of labor power and shorten necessary labor time in proportion to this. But he contributes toward increasing the general rate of surplus value only insofar as he ultimately contributes to this result. The general and necessary tendencies of capital must be distinguished from their forms of appearance. While it is not our intention here to consider the way in which the immanent laws of capitalist production manifest themselves in the external movement of the individual capitals, assert themselves as the coercive laws of competition, and therefore enter into the consciousness of the individual capitalist as the motives which drive him forward, this much is clear. A scientific analysis of competition is possible only if we can grasp the inner nature of capital, just as the apparent motions of the heavenly bodies are intelligible only to someone who is acquainted with their real motions, which are not perceptible to the senses. Nevertheless, for the understanding of the production of relative surplus value, and merely on the basis of the results already achieved, we may add the following remarks. If 1 hour's labor is embodied in sixpence, a value of 6 shillings will be produced in a working day of 12 hours. Suppose that, with labor of the currently prevailing productivity, 12 articles are produced in these 12 hours. Let the value of the means of production used up in each article be 6 pence. Under these circumstances, each article costs 1 shilling. 6 pence for the value of the means of production, and 6 pence for the value newly added in working with those means. Now let some one capitalist contrive to double the productivity of labor, and to produce 24 instead of 12 articles in the course of a working day of 12 hours. The value of the means of production remaining the same, the value of each article will fall to 9 pence, made up of 6 pence for the value of the means of production, and 3 pence for the value newly added by the labor. Even though the productivity of labor has been doubled, the day's labor creates, as before, a new value of 6 shillings, and no more, which is now, however, spread over twice as many articles. Each article now has embodied in it 1/24 of this value instead of 1/12, 3 pence instead of 6 pence. Or, what amounts to the same thing, only half an hour of labor time instead of a whole hour is now added to the means of production while they are being transformed into each article. The individual value of these articles is now below their social value. In other words, they have cost less labor time than the great bulk of the same article produced under the average social conditions. Each article costs, on average, 1 shilling, and represents 2 hours of social labor. But under the altered mode of production it costs only 9 pence, or contains only 1.5 hours labor. The real value of a commodity, however, is not its individual but its social value. That is to say, its value is not measured by the labor time that the article cost the producer in each individual case, but by the labor time socially required for its production. If, therefore, the capitalist who applies the new method sells his commodity at its social value of 1 shilling, he sells it for 3 pence above its individual value, and thus he realizes an extra surplus value of 3 pence. On the other hand, the working day of 12 hours is now represented for him by 24 articles instead of 12. Hence, in order to get rid of the product of one working day, the demand must be double what it was, i.e., the market must become twice as extensive. Other things being equal, the capitalist's commodities can only command a more extensive market if their prices are reduced. He will therefore sell them above their individual value, but below their social value, say at 10 pence each. By this means he still squeezes an extra surplus value of 1 penny out of each. This augmentation of surplus value is pocketed by the capitalist himself, whether or not his commodities belong to the class of necessary means of subsistence and therefore participate in determining the general value of labor power. Hence, quite independently of this, there is a motive for each individual capitalist to cheapen his commodities by increasing the productivity of labor. Nevertheless, even in this case, the increased production of surplus value arises from the curtailment of the necessary labor time, and the corresponding prolongation of surplus labor. Let the necessary labor time amount to 10 hours, the value of a day's labor to 5 shillings, the surplus labor time to 2 hours, and the daily surplus value to 1 shilling. But the capitalist now produces 24 articles, which he sells at 10 pence each, making 20 shillings in all. Since the value of the means of production is 12 shillings, 14 2/5 of these articles merely replace the constant capital advanced. The labor of the 12-hour working day is represented by the remaining 9 3/5 articles. Since the price of the labor power is 5 shillings, 6 articles represent the necessary labor time, and 3 3/5 articles the surplus labor. The ratio of necessary labor to surplus labor, which under average social conditions was 5:1, is now only 5:3. We may arrive at the same result in the following way. The value of the product of the working day of 12 hours is 20 shillings. Of this sum, 12 shillings represent the value of the means of production, a value that merely reappears in the finished product. There remain 8 shillings, which are the expression in money of the value newly created during the working day. This sum is greater than the sum in which average social labor of the same kind is expressed. 12 hours of the latter labor are expressed by only 6 shillings. The exceptionally productive labor acts as intensified labor. It creates, in equal periods of time, greater values than the average social labor of the same kind. But our capitalist still continues to pay, as before, only 5 shillings, as the daily value of labor power. Hence, instead of 10 hours, the worker now needs to work for only 7 1/5 hours in order to reproduce this value. His surplus labor is therefore increased by 2 4/5 hours, and the surplus value which he produces grows from 1 into 3 shillings. Hence, the capitalist who applies the improved method of production appropriates and devotes to surplus labor a greater portion of the working day than the other capitalists in the same business. He does as an individual what capital itself taken as a whole does when engaged in producing relative surplus value. On the other hand, however, this extra surplus value vanishes as soon as the new method of production is generalized, for then the difference between the individual value of the cheapened commodity and its social value vanishes. The law of the determination of value by labor time makes itself felt to the individual capitalist who applies the new methods of production by compelling him to sell his goods under their social value. This same law, acting as a coercive law of competition, forces his competitors to adopt the new method.
The general rate of surplus value is therefore ultimately affected by the whole process only when the increase in the productivity of labor has seized upon those branches of production and cheapened those commodities that contribute towards the necessary means of subsistence, and are therefore elements of the value of labor power. The value of commodities stands in inverse ratio to the productivity of labor. So too does the value of labor power, since it depends on the values of commodities. Relative surplus value, however, is directly proportional to the productivity of labor. It rises and falls together with productivity. The value of money being assumed to be constant, an average social working day of 12 hours always produces the same new value 6 shillings, no matter how this sum may be apportioned between surplus value and wages. But if, as a result of an increase in productivity, there is a fall in the value of the means of subsistence, and the daily value of labor power is thereby reduced from 5 shillings to 3, the surplus value will increase from 1 shillings to 3. 10 hours were necessary for the reproduction of the value of the labor power, and now only 6 are required. 4 hours have been set free, and can be annexed to the domain of surplus labor. Capital therefore has an imminent drive, and a constant tendency towards increasing the productivity of labor, in order to cheapen commodities, and, by cheapening commodities, to cheapen the worker himself. The absolute value of a commodity is, in itself, of no interest to the capitalist who produces it. All that interests him is the surplus value present in it, which can be realized by sale. Realization of the surplus value necessarily carries with it the replacement of the value advanced. Now, since relative surplus value increases in direct proportion to the development of the productivity of labor, while the value of commodities stands in precisely the opposite relation to the growth of productivity, since the same process both cheapens commodities and augments the surplus value contained in them, we have here the solution of the following riddle. Why does the capitalist, whose sole concern is to produce exchange value, continually strive to bring down the exchange value of commodities? One of the founders of political economy, Quesnay, used to torment his opponents with this question, and they could find no answer to it. You acknowledge, he says, that the more one can reduce the expenses and costs of labor in the manufacture of industrial products without injury to production, the more advantageous is that reduction, because it diminishes the price of the finished article. And yet you believe that the production of wealth, which arises from the labor of the craftsmen, consists in the augmentation of exchange value of their products. The shortening of the working day, therefore, is by no means what is aimed at in capitalist production, when labor is economized by increasing its productivity. It is only the shortening of the labor time necessary for the production of a definite quantity of commodities that is aimed at. The fact that the worker, when the productivity of his labor has been increased, produces, say, 10 times as many commodities as before, and thus spends 1/10 as much labor time on each, by no means prevents him from continuing to work 12 hours as before, nor from producing in those 12 hours 1,200 articles instead of 120. Indeed, his working day may simultaneously be prolonged, so as to make him produce, say, 1,400 articles in 14 hours. Therefore, in the treatise of economists of the stamp of McCulloch, Ure, Senior, and the like, we may read on one page that the worker owes a debt of gratitude to capital for developing his productivity, because the necessary labor time is thereby shortened, and on the next page that he must prove his gratitude by working in future for 15 hours instead of 10. The objective of the development of the productivity of labor within the context of capitalist production is the shortening of that part of the working day in which the worker must work for himself, and the lengthening thereby of the other part of the day in which he is free to work for nothing for the capitalist. How far this result can also be attained without cheapening commodities will appear from the following chapters, where we examine the particular methods of producing relative surplus value.